platform.
Inclusive, diverse, forward-looking, progressive, worker-friendly. We're not your dad's Conservative Party anymore.
Or as this meme put it, I can't believe it's not liberal. Light. O'Toole adopted positions that were identical to, or very similar to, those being pushed by Trudeau, including a firm pro-choice stance on abortion, a national carbon tax to fight climate change, billions of dollars in new spending to deal with the post-COVID recovery, increased funding for Canada's public healthcare system, no budget cuts to government programs, and increased immigration. Now, there are a few theories on why this pitch didn't work. One is just that it is kind of hard to run as something that you're not. A Conservative Party candidate who claims to be a progressive will invite a lot of skepticism and may actually increase scrutiny of himself as critics try to expose him as a phony. As a result, near the end, the Liberals really zeroed in on the areas where O'Toole did still seem to have some residual right-wing views. Guns, where he initially opposed Trudeau's recent expansion of Canada's prohibited firearms list, and mandatory COVID vaccinations for workers or travelers, which he opposed for infringing on personal choice. Now, neither of these positions are exactly right-wing extremism, but the Liberals still made a big deal about them, saying they were at odds with O'Toole's claim of leading a new, more progressive party.
Aaron O'Toole says he wants to take Canada back. He also says he'll repeal the Liberal ban on assault weapons. He has promised to scrap the Liberal plan for mandatory vaccines on planes and trains.
Which critics would in turn say says something about the viability of O'Toole's strategy, since even a Conservative at his most progressive will never be progressive enough to appease his opponents on the left. But this also gets into a more existential concern about Canadian democracy. Namely, to what degree are Canadians even all that persuadable when it comes to politics? Even if his campaign wasn't perfect, you would at least expect O'Toole's strategy to pick up a couple of seats in moderate areas here or there, or even cost him a couple of seats in conservative areas that might be turned off by his approach. Yet when you look at the before and after election maps, you can see that basically nowhere in Canada voted substantially differently this time around than they did in 2019. The Conservatives still swept all of the most right-wing areas of the country, namely the prairie provinces and rural areas, while the Liberals swept mostly urban and suburban ones. The region around Toronto, which is one of Canada's major population centres, has long been heavily fetishized by Conservative strategists over the years, and a more moderate approach was considered key to making inroads here. And yet, as you can see from these two maps, basically nothing changed. And it wasn't like the Conservatives just barely lost either. A lot of these individual races had basically the exact same popular vote breakdown as they did 2 years ago. What results like this suggest to me is that even though election campaigns are theoretically fought over policy and ideas, and the media encourages us to study the platforms and all of that, a lot of Canadians don't actually vote this way. A lot of us simply have fairly hardwired beliefs about which party we like and which party we don't like, and we tend to vote on the basis of these entrenched beliefs and stereotypes. While swing voters who are open-minded about changing their party preferences obviously exist, it does seem like there are a lot fewer of them than previously assumed, and it seems a lot harder to predict what can get them to switch. This is also a useful thing to think about when we look at the campaign of the New Democratic Party under Jagmeet Singh. Like O'Toole, Singh also had a very novel campaign strategy this time around, which was basically to win over the youngs. Through a combination of left-wing policy positions and constant appearances on things like TikTok and Twitch and YouTube and even Animal Crossing, the hope was that the NDP could energize and activate some new generation of voters of the sort who don't ordinarily participate in Canadian politics. There doesn't seem to be much evidence that this novel scheme worked either. Like the Conservatives, the NDP also just won in the same handful of places they usually win anyway, and they only saw a tiny rise in their share of the popular vote. They remain in 4th place in Parliament, behind the Bloc Québécois, which I think we can all agree is quite the humiliation. The NDP has generally low expectations for itself, but they would certainly have plenty of justification to kick out Singh at this point, given he has now unsuccessfully led his party through 2 elections, and his unique theory of politics doesn't seem particularly borne out by the facts. And then there is the People's Party. A lot of the analysis I've read so far doesn't seem to quite know what our takeaway from the 5% show showing of the People's Party should be. The PPC is a new right-wing populist party that sought to capitalize on O'Toole's moderation, as well as outrage from the faction of the public that is the most ferociously opposed to COVID public safety measures like masks and lockdowns and vaccines. On the one hand, the party tripled its share of the popular vote on just its second ever election. In theory, this means that the media will presumably begin treating them as a major party in the Canadian system from now on. 5% is generally about as good as the Green Party ever does, and they're always treated as a major party, included in things like election debates and graphics and things. On the other hand, the People's Party won 0 seats, once again failing to even win the seat of party leader Maxime Bernier. They also quite underperformed expectations, given that some polls had them as high as 10%, supposedly reflecting the depth of public backlash to COVID restrictions. As anyone who has read an online comments thread about Canadian politics recently will know, People's Party supporters tend to be very loud and very online and are not exactly known for setting expectations low. But instead of the PPC wave they promised, the party simply did best in parts of the country that are already very right-wing. Some elections in rural areas, in fact, are now effectively PPC versus Conservative contests, with the PPC usually coming in a distant second. But on the other hand, according to the CBC, the PPC may have cost the Conservatives up to 24 ridings in close races due to vote splitting. Obviously, not everyone who voted PPC would have voted Conservative if the PPC didn't exist. And not every Conservative gain would have necessarily come at the expense of a Liberal seat either. But at the very least, it certainly does seem like even a 5% PPC is enough to do significant damage to the Conservatives' odds of victory. And one assumes this will be one of the main arguments against keeping O'Toole around for another election. Speaking of fringe parties, Monday night was also notable for marking the collapse of the Green Party, sort of. The Greens have been rocked by significant internal turmoil lately, as well as financial difficulties. They were only able to run candidates in a third of the country. Their popular vote plummeted to just 2%, and their mostly unknown and unpopular leader, Anna May Paul, finished a distant 4th in a riding she had devoted much of the party's energy to winning. The Greens only won 2 seats, the one held by former leader Elizabeth May, who has established a personal fiefdom on Vancouver Island and will probably hold that seat for the rest of her life, and one in Ontario. That was kind of a weird situation. The incumbent Liberal candidate had to step down mid-election due to a sex scandal, and it seems a lot of progressive voters just shifted their support to the Green guy in the aftermath, so kind of a fluky scenario. But this is a good segue into the next big takeaway from the election, which is some of the structural problems with the Canadian political system itself, which are becoming harder and harder to ignore. Canada has a plurality-based electoral system, but also a growing number of political parties, some of which are very regional, others national. And what this increasingly seems to be producing is an almost total disconnect from the popular vote and the makeup of the parliament. Based on his share of the popular vote, Justin Trudeau is now basically the most unpopular prime minister in Canadian history, having now twice been elected with less than 34% of the vote, something which has never happened before. This chart here shows that the share of the popular vote that our prime ministers have been winning has in fact been trending downward for quite some time. You can see it is now consistently below 40%. The Conservative Party, by contrast, has now twice won the popular vote back-to-back without winning power, which is also something that has never happened before. But this is because the Conservative Party is increasingly a regional party of Western Canada that sweeps that region's limited number of seats by very large margins, whereas the Liberal Party wins more seats across the country, but with smaller margins each. Indeed, a lot of Liberal margins of victory are incredibly narrow. If we look at the Globe and Mail's list of 30 key swing ridings, the Liberals swept many of these areas with numbers like 45%, 42%, even 35%. The Liberals do very well in districts where at least 2 other parties are highly competitive, which is kind of an arbitrary variable. The Quebec Nationalist Party, the Bloc Québécois, only got 8% of the popular vote, but it is the 3rd largest party in Parliament because its vote is, of course, completely concentrated in Quebec. The People's Party got 0 seats because their 5% is broadly diffused, while the Greens got 2 because their 2% is efficiently concentrated. I don't know if there is an easy escape from some of this weirdness. People talk all the time about electoral reform, But it is not obvious how a new electoral system would necessarily solve these problems, because of course not everyone would agree what exactly the problems are. It's not clear, for instance, that everyone would agree that a system that weakens the bloc but strengthens the Conservatives would be a good thing. People want a system that preserves strong regional representation, but also perfectly reflects the national will. And these two objectives are just kind of fundamentally at odds. It does seem to me, however, that Canada probably has a lot more political parties than is really necessary. Larger parties that allow